On August 12, 1982, a Mexican finance minister walked into three offices in Washington: the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, and the International Monetary Fund. His message was simple. Mexico could no longer pay its debts. $80 billion. Gone. Overnight. Within weeks, Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela followed. $315 billion in total, half of Latin America's GDP, suddenly became unpayable. The world's largest banks faced collapse. Entire nations teetered on the edge of economic oblivion. But here's what nobody talks about. The crisis didn't start in Mexico City or Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo. It started in a conference room at the Federal Reserve in Washington, with a decision made by one man that would destroy a generation's prosperity across an entire continent. This is the story of how American monetary policy became Latin America's economic execution. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history are woven together to shape the world we live in. Today, we're examining one of the most devastating financial catastrophes of the 20th century, a crisis that erased a decade of development, impoverished millions, and reshaped the global economic order. A crisis engineered not by the countries that suffered it, but by forces far beyond their borders. To understand August 1982, you must first understand the world that made it possible. In the 1970s, Latin America was booming. From 1970 to 1980, Brazil's economy grew at an average annual rate of 7%. Mexico discovered massive oil reserves that made it one of the world's largest petroleum producers. Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, all were riding waves of industrial expansion, infrastructure investment, and rising living standards. The money fueling this transformation came from an unexpected source: Middle Eastern oil. When oil prices quadrupled in 1973 and again in 1979, petroleum exporting nations in the Gulf suddenly held hundreds of billions of dollars in surplus revenues. They needed somewhere safe to put it. Enter the major U.S. commercial banks: Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. These institutions took OPEC's petrodollars and funneled them to Latin America in the form of loans. The arrangement seemed perfect. Oil exporters earned interest. American banks earned fees. Latin American governments financed modernization. Between 1970 and 1982, Latin American external debt exploded from $29 billion to $327 billion. At the end of 1970, this debt was manageable. By 1982, it had grown 11-fold. The borrowing accelerated particularly after 1975, increasing at a cumulative annual rate of over 20%. The loans carried variable interest rates tied to U.S. benchmarks. As long as American interest rates stayed low and commodity prices stayed high, the system worked. Latin American countries exported copper, coffee, oil, and agricultural products to earn dollars, then used those dollars to service their debts. But the system had a fatal vulnerability. It assumed stability. It assumed that the rules governing global finance would remain constant. It assumed that the United States would continue prioritizing global economic growth over domestic inflation control. In 1979, that assumption shattered. And the man who shattered it wasn't even elected. Paul Volcker arrived at the Federal Reserve chairmanship on August 6, 1979, with a singular mission: kill inflation. For more than a decade, the United States had struggled with rising prices. Oil shocks, Vietnam War spending, and loose monetary policy had pushed inflation to levels unseen since the immediate post-World War II years. By March 1980, the Consumer Price Index was rising at an annual rate of 14.8%. Workers demanded higher wages to keep pace. Businesses raised prices to cover costs. A wage price spiral threatened to spiral out of control. Volcker, a towering figure at 6'7" with a reputation for uncompromising discipline, believed that only one solution existed: dramatically raise interest rates to choke off demand, even if it meant triggering a recession. On October 6, 1979, after an unscheduled Saturday meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee, Volcker announced a revolutionary change in Fed policy. Instead of directly setting interest rates, the Fed would target the money supply itself, limiting the total amount of credit available in the economy and letting market forces push rates as high as necessary. The technical approach was deliberate. By targeting money supply rather than announcing rate increases directly, Volcker could deflect political responsibility. He wouldn't be raising rates, the market would. But make no mistake, the outcome was predetermined. The federal funds rate, the overnight rate at which banks lend to each other, had averaged 11.2% in 1979. By March 1980, it hit 17%. Volcker briefly allowed it to fall. Then, when inflation didn't decline fast enough, he tightened again. In December 1980, the rate climbed back to 20%. In June 1981, it peaked at 19.1%, the highest in American history. The prime rate, what banks charged their best customers, reached 21.5%. For Latin America, this was catastrophic. Remember, their debts carried variable interest rates. When U.S. rates doubled, then tripled, debt service costs exploded. Countries that had borrowed at near zero real interest rates in the mid-1970s suddenly faced payments they could never have anticipated. Mexico's debt service obligations alone jumped from $12 billion in 1975 to $66 billion in 1982. But rising interest rates were only part of the problem. Volcker's monetary tightening worked exactly as intended in the United States. Demand collapsed. Businesses couldn't afford to invest. Consumers couldn't afford to buy. By 1981, the world economy entered recession, the deepest since the Great Depression. Global trade contracted. Commodity prices, which had sustained Latin American export earnings throughout the 1970s, collapsed. Copper prices fell. Coffee prices fell. Agricultural products fell. Even oil, which had been Mexico's ticket to prosperity, began a long decline from its 1980 peaks. Latin American countries faced a perfect storm. Their costs were rising due to high interest rates, while their revenues were falling due to collapsing export prices. The foreign exchange they needed to service dollar-denominated debts simply wasn't there. By mid-1982, the mathematics had become impossible. Countries were borrowing new money just to pay interest on old debts, a classic debt trap. Commercial banks, recognizing the deteriorating situation, began shortening repayment periods and demanding even higher rates to compensate for risk. Mexico held out longer than most. Through 1981 and early 1982, it continued making payments, desperately hoping for a turnaround. But by summer, the numbers no longer added up. On August 12, 1982, Mexican Finance Minister Jesus Silva Herzog made his fateful rounds in Washington. His message to Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan, and IMF Managing Director Jacques de Larosière was blunt. Mexico's $80 billion in external debt was unsustainable. The country needed a 90-day moratorium on payments and emergency negotiations to restructure its obligations. The announcement sent shockwaves through global financial markets. If Mexico, one of the largest emerging economies, America's neighbor, a major oil producer, couldn't pay, who could? The answer, almost nobody. The contagion spread with terrifying speed. Within weeks of Mexico's announcement, 16 developing nations found themselves unable to service their foreign debt. 12 of them were in Latin America. Brazil, with the region's largest economy, owed various creditors over $90 billion. Argentina owed $43 billion. Venezuela owed $35 billion. Together, the four largest debtors, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, and Argentina, accounted for $176 billion, approximately 74% of all Latin American debt outstanding. The exposure of American banks was staggering. The 8 largest U.S. money center banks held approximately $37 billion in Latin American loans. That represented 147% of their combined capital and reserves. A default cascade would wipe them out. Citibank alone faced potential losses of $3.3 billion. For context, that exceeded the bank's entire capital base at the time. Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, Manufacturers Hanover, all faced similar existential threats. The crisis wasn't just financial, it was systemic. If Latin American countries defaulted en masse, it would trigger bank failures in the United States and Europe. Those failures would contract credit globally, deepening the recession, causing more defaults, creating a feedback loop that could replicate the 1930s banking collapse. The Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, the IMF, and the World Bank convened emergency meetings. Their initial response focused on containing panic and buying time. The strategy had 3 components. First, emergency bridge loans. The Federal Reserve, working with the Bank for International Settlements, and other central banks, provided short-term liquidity to Mexico and other countries on the brink of default. These loans gave governments just enough breathing room to avoid immediate collapse, while longer-term solutions were negotiated. Second, debt rescheduling. Rather than writing off loans, banks agreed to extend repayment timelines and roll over maturing debt. The fiction maintained was that these countries faced temporary liquidity problems, not fundamental insolvency. If given more time, they would grow their way out of debt. Third, IMF conditionality. In exchange for financial support, Latin American governments had to implement what became known as structural adjustment programs. These programs demanded fiscal austerity, sharp cuts to government spending, elimination of subsidies, tax increases, currency devaluation, trade liberalization, privatization of state enterprises, and deregulation of domestic markets. The theory was straightforward. By reducing government deficits and reorienting economies toward exports, countries would generate the foreign exchange needed to service their debts. Market-based reforms would attract new investment and restore creditworthiness. The reality was far more brutal. From 1982 through 1989, Latin American countries engaged in round after round of debt rescheduling, 14 major restructurings in total. Each negotiation followed the same pattern: Creditors would agree to extend payment deadlines and sometimes provide new money, while debtors would promise deeper austerity and structural reforms. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The debt itself was mathematically unpayable. No amount of rescheduling could change that fact. You can't reschedule yourself out of insolvency when your debt service obligations exceed your capacity to earn foreign exchange. By 1984, it became clear that the initial strategy, pretending this was a liquidity crisis rather than a solvency crisis, had failed. U.S. banks, regulators, and policymakers faced a choice: acknowledge that losses were real and write down debt, or continue the fiction, and hope economic recovery would eventually make the numbers work. They chose to continue the fiction. In October 1985, U.S. Treasury Secretary James Baker announced what became known as the Baker Plan. The proposal called for banks to provide $15 billion in new lending over 3 years, with international financial institutions adding another $9 billion. In exchange, debtor nations would accelerate market-oriented reforms. The plan was fundamentally flawed. It still refused to acknowledge insolvency. It still demanded that heavily indebted countries borrow more to service existing debt. And crucially, banks weren't obligated to participate. The plan relied on voluntary compliance. Most banks refused. By the mid-1980s, commercial banks had begun reducing their exposure to Latin American debt through the secondary market. The secondary market gave banks an exit strategy that new lending commitments did not. The Baker Plan raised only a fraction of its targeted amount. Meanwhile, Latin American debt burdens continued to grow. From 1982 to 1987, the region transferred $141 billion in net payments to creditors, far more than it received in new loans or aid. Latin America had become a net exporter of capital to the developed world. The human cost was staggering. Per capita GDP across Latin America fell from 112% of the world average in 1980 to 98% by 1990. Compared to developed countries, the region's per capita GDP dropped from 34% to 26%. A generation of development progress evaporated. Unemployment soared. Inflation, ironically, returned with a vengeance as governments printed money to cover deficits they couldn't finance through borrowing. By 1989, Argentina's inflation exceeded 3,000% annually. Brazil's topped 1,000%. But the greatest cost was measured in poverty. In 1980, 40.5% of Latin America's population lived in poverty. By 1990, that figure had risen to 48.3%. Real wages collapsed. Government spending on health, education, and infrastructure was slashed. Child malnutrition rates climbed. Life expectancy gains stalled. The 1980s became known throughout Latin America as La Década Perdida, the lost decade. By 1988, even the architects of the crisis could no longer maintain the fiction. Major commercial banks had spent years building capital reserves and writing down portions of their Latin American portfolios. By the end of 1988, banks had reduced their exposure to Latin America's troubled sovereigns by nearly 50%. They had sold loans on secondary markets, sometimes for as little as 30 cents on the dollar. They had diversified their risk and strengthened their balance sheets. The threat of systemic banking collapse had passed, which meant finally that honest conversations about debt relief could begin. The breakthrough came not from Latin America, but from a change in U.S. political leadership. In January 1989, George H.W. Bush was inaugurated as president. He appointed Nicholas Brady as Treasury Secretary. Brady, a former investment banker and senator, understood that the debt crisis required a fundamental departure from previous approaches. Working with his deputy David Mulford, Japanese Vice Minister of Finance Makoto Utsumi, and IMF Managing Director Michel Kamdesis, Brady developed a plan that acknowledged what everyone had known for years, but refused to say publicly: the debt could not be fully repaid. Forgiveness was necessary. On March 10, 1989, Secretary Brady announced his proposal. The Brady Plan called for banks to accept permanent reductions in loan principal and debt service obligations. In exchange, debtor nations would receive greater assurance of collectability through collateralized bonds backed by U.S. Treasury securities. The bonds would also be tradable, allowing banks to exit their positions through markets rather than holding liquid loans indefinitely. The plan offered banks a menu of options. They could exchange loans for discount bonds, reducing principal but keeping market interest rates. They could accept par bonds, maintaining face value but accepting below-market interest rates of 6.25%. Or they could provide new money equivalent to 25% of their exposure. Mexico became the first country to negotiate under the Brady framework. In 1989 and 1990, Mexico restructured $48.9 billion in commercial debt. Banks chose to swap 49% of their loans for discount bonds, 41% for par bonds, and 10% into new money provisions. The principal and interest on the new bonds were collateralized by specially issued U.S. Treasury zero-coupon bonds purchased using a combination of IMF loans, World Bank support, and Mexico's own reserves. The deal resulted in significant debt forgiveness. While the exact numbers varied by country and option chosen, the average face value reduction across all Brady deals was approximately 35%. Other countries followed rapidly. Costa Rica in 1989, Venezuela and Uruguay in 1990 and 1991, Argentina and Brazil in 1992, the Philippines, Poland, Bulgaria. Eventually, 18 countries participated in Brady restructurings. Between 1989 and 1994, private lenders forgave $61 billion in loans, about one-third of total outstanding debt. For the first time since 1982, Latin American countries received genuine debt relief rather than endless rescheduling. But the Brady Plan came with conditions. Participating countries had to implement comprehensive market-oriented reforms: trade liberalization, investment deregulation, tax reform, budget cuts, elimination of subsidies, large-scale privatization, minimum wage reductions, and financial market liberalization. These reforms, collectively known as the Washington Consensus, fundamentally restructured Latin American economies. State-owned enterprises were sold to private investors, often at bargain prices. Capital controls were eliminated. Labor protections were weakened. Social spending was permanently reduced. The stated goal was to create conditions for sustainable growth that would prevent future crises. The actual effect was to transfer ownership of significant national assets to international capital and lock in policies that prioritize creditor interests over domestic development needs. Critics argued that the Brady Plan, while providing necessary debt relief, came 7 years too late. If implemented in 1982 or 1983, it might have prevented the lost decade. Instead, Latin America endured years of unnecessary suffering, while banks slowly built the capital cushions that made them willing to accept losses. Others pointed out that the plan's success in resolving the crisis said more about bank balance sheets than debtor nation recovery. By 1989, banks were strong enough to absorb losses. That's why debt forgiveness became politically feasible, not because Latin American suffering had finally moved policymakers to act. The IMF adopted a crucial new policy in 1989 that made the Brady framework possible: lending into arrears. Previously, if any private creditor refused to restructure, the IMF couldn't provide support. The holdout creditor could effectively veto IMF assistance. The new policy allowed the IMF to lend to countries in arrears to private creditors, so long as the country negotiated in good faith. This eliminated holdout power and forced creditor coordination. For Latin America, the Brady Plan marked a turning point. Capital began flowing back into the region. Economic growth resumed, though unevenly. By the mid-1990s, several countries had regained access to international capital markets on favorable terms. But the scars ran deep. The Latin American debt crisis reshaped not just the region's economy, but its entire social and political fabric. Economically, the 1980s erased decades of development. From 1950 to 1980, Latin America had been one of the world's fastest-growing regions, with per capita GDP growth averaging nearly 3% annually. From 1980 to 1990, growth averaged zero. An entire decade produced no improvement in living standards. In many countries, conditions deteriorated significantly. Brazil, once hailed as an economic miracle, saw per capita income stagnate. Mexico's economy, which had grown at an average of 6.5% annually through the 1970s, contracted in the early 1980s and grew anemia Cali for the remainder of the decade. Argentina suffered a complete economic collapse, with GDP falling by over 10% in 1982 alone, and inflation spiraling into hyperinflation by decade's end. The structural adjustment programs demanded by the IMF and World Bank exacerbated social inequalities. Budget cuts fell disproportionately on the poor, education spending declined, healthcare systems deteriorated, infrastructure investment halted, subsidies for basic goods, bread, fuel, transportation, were eliminated, causing prices to spike for the most vulnerable. Real wages collapsed across the region. In Mexico, real minimum wages fell by 40% during the 1980s. In Peru, they fell by over 60%. Workers who had spent the 1970s climbing into the middle class suddenly found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The poverty rate told the story most starkly. In 1980, 135 million Latin Americans lived below the poverty line. By 1990, that number had climbed to 204 million, an increase of 69 million people pushed into poverty over a single decade. The gains of an entire generation were reversed. The crisis hit specific groups particularly hard. Urban workers who lost manufacturing jobs faced few alternatives. Informal sector employment exploded as people turned to street vending, domestic work, and other unregulated activities just to survive. Youth unemployment soared, creating a generation that came of age during economic collapse. Public institutions crumbled. Universities couldn't afford professors. Hospitals lacked medicine. Police departments couldn't maintain equipment. The erosion of state capacity would have consequences lasting decades, creating power vacuums that criminal organizations would eventually fill. Politically, the debt crisis delegitimized governments across Latin America. Citizens watched their leaders sign agreement after agreement with the IMF, each time promising that austerity would restore prosperity. Each time, conditions worsened. The perception took hold that governments serve foreign creditors rather than their own populations. In Brazil, mass protests erupted against IMF policies. In 1989, Brazilian officials held a debt negotiation meeting where they vowed to never again sign agreements with the IMF. In Venezuela, IMF-mandated austerity measures in 1989 triggered riots that killed hundreds. In Argentina, hyperinflation and economic collapse led to the resignation of President Raúl Alfonsín in 1989, months before his term ended. The debt crisis accelerated Latin America's transition away from authoritarian rule, but not in the way democracy advocates had hoped. Military governments that had borrowed heavily in the 1970s were discredited by their inability to manage the consequences. Democratic governments that replaced them inherited impossible situations, debts they didn't create, combined with IMF conditions that required policies guaranteed to be unpopular. The result was democratic systems born in crisis, associated from their inception with economic pain and subordination to foreign institutions. This created lasting skepticism about democracy's ability to deliver prosperity, a skepticism that would shape Latin American politics for decades. Socially, the crisis shattered the post-war development model. For 30 years, Latin American countries had pursued import substitution industrialization, using tariffs and state intervention to build domestic industries. The model had significant flaws, but it had also produced real gains in industrialization, employment, and living standards. The Washington Consensus, imposed in exchange for debt relief, dismantled this model entirely. Tariffs were slashed, state enterprises were privatized, capital controls were eliminated. The idea that governments should actively guide development was replaced with faith in market forces. Some benefited enormously. A new class of wealthy Latin Americans acquired formerly state-owned assets at discounted prices. Foreign corporations gained access to markets previously closed to them. Financial services firms profited from liberalization. A thin layer at the top of the income distribution saw their wealth multiply. But for the majority, the 1990s brought joblessness as domestic industries collapsed under import competition, insecurity as social safety nets were dismantled, and inequality as wealth concentrated among those positioned to exploit privatization. The creditors who triggered the crisis bore remarkably little cost. U.S. commercial banks, after years of rescheduling and Brady bond exchanges, ultimately recovered most of their capital. The write-downs they took in the late 1980s were absorbed by reserves built over years of profits. Many banks emerged from the crisis stronger than before, having learned to diversify their portfolios and manage emerging market risk more carefully. The official sector, the IMF, World Bank, and creditor governments, faced no reckoning whatsoever. The institutions that had encouraged overlending in the 1970s, that imposed crushing austerity in the 1980s, maintained their authority throughout. If anything, the crisis expanded their power, as more countries became dependent on their financing and subject to their conditions. Latin American citizens paid the price. They paid through lost jobs, collapsed wages, reduced public services, and a decade of their lives spent in economic survival mode rather than progress. The crisis also fundamentally altered Latin America's position in the global economy. Before 1982, the region had been moving toward greater economic independence, with ambitions to build advanced industrial capacity and chart its own development path. After the crisis and the Washington Consensus reforms, Latin America became more integrated into global markets, but on terms largely dictated by outside forces. The lost decade would eventually be followed by recovery. Growth returned in the 1990s. Some countries, like Chile, found paths to relatively stable development. Others continued to struggle with boom-bust cycles, debt accumulation, and external vulnerability. But Latin America in 2000 was fundamentally different from Latin America in 1980. The crisis had redistributed power, wealth, and opportunity in ways that would persist long after the debts themselves were resolved. The Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint, one that has been followed with variations, in crisis after crisis over the past 4 decades. The first parallel is structural, how developed country monetary policy exports instability to emerging markets. When Paul Volcker raised U.S. interest rates to combat American inflation, he gave no consideration to the global consequences. His mandate was domestic price stability. The fact that his policies would bankrupt dozens of countries and impoverish millions was not part of the calculation. It wasn't malicious. It simply wasn't considered relevant. This pattern has repeated. In 2013, when the Federal Reserve announced it would begin tapering its bond buying program, emerging markets from India to Brazil experienced capital flight and currency crises, the taper tantrum. In 2022, when the Fed raised rates aggressively to combat post-COVID inflation, emerging market currencies plummeted, debt service costs soared, and countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan faced debt distress. The mechanism is identical. Dollar-denominated debt becomes more expensive when U.S. rates rise, while capital flows reverse as investors seek higher returns in safer U.S. assets. Emerging markets experience simultaneous increases in debt burdens and decreases in financing availability, the same trap that ensnared Latin America in 1982. The second parallel is the fiction of liquidity versus solvency. Throughout the 1980s, creditors insisted that Latin American countries faced temporary liquidity problems, not fundamental insolvency. This allowed endless rescheduling while avoiding write-downs that would have required banks to acknowledge losses. The fiction persisted for 7 years, during which Latin America transferred hundreds of billions to creditors while sinking deeper into poverty. The European debt crisis of 2010-2015 followed the same script. Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland were declared to have liquidity problems solvable through austerity and reform. Bailout funds were provided, not to help these countries, but to protect European banks exposed to their debt. The funds flowed in and immediately back out to creditors, while recipient countries endured crushing austerity. Eventually, as in Latin America, reality forced acknowledgement of insolvency. Greece received significant debt relief in 2012, but only after years of economic contraction that destroyed a quarter of its GDP and pushed unemployment above 25%. The third parallel is the use of conditionality to impose policy preferences. The Washington Consensus reforms demanded of Latin America in the 1980s, privatization, deregulation, trade liberalization, reduced social spending, reflected a specific ideological vision of how economies should function. These policies weren't technically necessary to resolve debt problems. Debt relief could have been provided without requiring countries to restructure their entire economic systems. But the debt crisis created leverage. Countries desperate for financing had no choice but to accept whatever conditions creditors imposed. The IMF and World Bank used their gatekeeper role to enforce a particular model of capitalism, one that emphasized markets over states, private enterprise over public goods, integration over autonomy. This pattern has continued in every subsequent crisis. Argentina in 2001, Ukraine in 2014, Lebanon in 2020, all received crisis financing accompanied by demands for structural reforms that reflected creditor preferences rather than debtor needs. The language has evolved from Washington Consensus to good governance to inclusive growth, but the substance remains. Those who control finance dictate policy to those who need it. The fourth parallel is the socialization of private banking losses. The Latin American debt crisis began with reckless overlending by private banks. Through the 1970s, commercial banks aggressively marketed loans to Latin American governments, often with minimal due diligence. They earned enormous fees. They paid their executives bonuses. When the debts went bad, they turned to public institutions, the Fed, the Treasury, the IMF, for rescue. The rescue came, but in a form that protected banks while punishing Latin American citizens. Public funds were used to provide bridge loans and support that kept countries current on payments to private creditors. When debt relief finally came via the Brady Plan, it was collateralized by public institutions. Taxpayers in creditor countries and citizens of debtor countries bore the costs. Bankers who made bad loans faced minimal consequences. The 2008 financial crisis followed identical logic. Private banks made catastrophically bad bets on mortgage securities. When the system collapsed, governments bailed out the banks using trillions in public funds. Citizens lost jobs, homes, and savings. Banks paid fines but remained intact. Executives faced no criminal charges. The pattern is now so entrenched that it's considered normal. Profits are private, losses are public. The fifth parallel is the long-term cost of short-term solutions. The Brady Plan resolved the immediate debt crisis, but it did so on terms that locked in long-term disadvantages for Latin America. Privatization transferred valuable state assets to foreign investors at bargain prices. Trade liberalization destroyed domestic industries before they could become competitive. Capital account liberalization exposed countries to destabilizing hot money flows. Reduced social spending created deficits in human capital that would take decades to recover. These choices, made under duress in exchange for debt relief, shaped Latin America's development trajectory for a generation. They weren't optimal policy, they were crisis policy, negotiated from a position of weakness. Current debt crises follow the same pattern. Countries in distress accept conditions that seem necessary in the moment but carry long-term costs. Sri Lanka privatized ports and infrastructure. Argentina opened its economy to foreign capital. Pakistan slashed subsidies and raised taxes. In each case, immediate financing needs override long-term development strategy. But perhaps the most important parallel is one that goes unspoken in policy circles. The debt crisis of the 1980s, like every crisis since, was never really resolved. It was merely transferred. Latin America's debt burden was partially reduced through Brady bonds, but the region remained highly indebted throughout the 1990s. When commodity prices surged in the 2000s, many countries borrowed again. When that cycle ended, debt problems returned. Argentina has restructured its debt 9 times since 1980. Ecuador defaulted on its Brady bonds in 1999, barely a decade after issuing them. The fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Developing countries need capital to industrialize, but borrowing in foreign currency leaves them vulnerable to exchange rate shocks, interest rate changes, and terms of trade volatility. When crises hit, they lack the monetary sovereignty to inflate away debts or the diplomatic power to refuse creditor demands. The system generates recurring crises by design. Each resolution creates conditions for the next crisis, and each time, the costs are borne by those least responsible for creating the problem. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a new wave of emerging market debt distress. The G20 responded with a debt service suspension initiative, allowing temporary payment deferrals. Zambia defaulted. Ghana restructured. Pakistan sought IMF support for the 23rd time. The language has changed. The institutional players have evolved. But the fundamental structure remains: monetary policy determined by developed countries, debt owed by developing countries, crises triggered by external shocks, and solutions imposed by creditors that protect their interests while demanding sacrifice from debtors. Until that structure changes, until there's a mechanism for fair, timely debt relief without crushing conditionality, until emerging markets have genuine monetary sovereignty, until capital flows are regulated to prevent the boom-bust cycle, the pattern will continue, and millions more will pay the price for financial systems they neither control nor benefit from. 3 lessons emerge from the wreckage of Latin America's lost decade. First, debt crises are never just about debt. They're about power. The Latin American debt crisis could have been resolved in 1982 with prompt recognition of insolvency and negotiated write-downs. The technology existed. The precedents existed. Sovereign debt restructuring had occurred many times in history. And what prevented resolution wasn't economic or technical obstacles. It was political economy. Banks had power because they held loans. The IMF and World Bank had power because they controlled financing. The United States had power because the dollar was the global reserve currency, and Fed policy determined global liquidity conditions. Latin American countries had no power because they were broke, divided, and dependent on external financing. So the crisis was resolved on terms that reflected that power imbalance. Banks took minimal losses. Official creditors expanded their authority. Latin American citizens endured a decade of suffering. The resolution wasn't economically optimal. It was politically feasible given the distribution of power. This remains true. Debt crises are resolved not through optimal economics, but through negotiations where outcomes reflect bargaining power. Understanding who suffers and who benefits in any crisis requires understanding who holds power, not just who holds debt. Second, monetary policy is geopolitical warfare by other means. Paul Volcker didn't set out to destroy Latin American development. He set out to control American inflation. But his policies had global consequences far exceeding their domestic effects. U.S. interest rate policy, because the dollar dominates global finance, is effectively global monetary policy, whether the Fed acknowledges that reality or not. This creates a fundamental injustice. The Fed's Open Market Committee consists of Americans, appointed by American politicians, accountable to American voters. But its decisions affect billions of people worldwide who have no voice in its deliberations. When it raises rates to combat American inflation, it exports recessions to emerging markets. When it cuts rates to stimulate American growth, it fuels asset bubbles abroad. Other countries have tried to escape this dynamic by creating alternative reserve currencies, establishing capital controls, or building foreign exchange reserves large enough to self-insure against shocks. Some have succeeded partially. But the dollar's dominance persists, and with it, the Fed's unilateral power over global financial conditions. Until the international monetary system is reformed to give non-Americans a voice in decisions that affect them, this injustice will continue. Until emerging markets have genuine monetary sovereignty, the ability to borrow in their own currencies, control their own exchange rates, and set their own interest rates without sparking capital flight, they will remain vulnerable to policy changes made in Washington for Washington's benefit. Third, we remember crises when banks fail, not when people do. The Latin American debt crisis is remembered in financial history as a near miss, a crisis that almost destabilized the global banking system, but was ultimately contained. The successful resolution is celebrated. The Brady Plan is studied in business schools as an innovative restructuring mechanism. But the human cost is forgotten. The 69 million people pushed into poverty, The generation that came of age during economic collapse, the children whose education was interrupted, whose nutrition suffered, whose opportunities disappeared, the workers whose savings were wiped out by inflation, the families who lost access to health care. These costs don't appear in financial analysis. They don't factor into assessments of whether a crisis was well managed. Success is measured by whether banks survived, whether bond markets stabilized, whether creditors were repaid. This is not accidental. It reflects whose suffering matters in the calculus of international finance. Bank failures threaten the wealth of powerful people and the stability of politically important institutions. Human suffering in distant countries does not. The debt crisis teaches us that the international financial system is designed to protect capital, not people. It will always prioritize creditor rights over debtor welfare. It will always prefer orderly repayment over genuine relief. It will always demand sacrifice from those with the least while protecting those with the most. And until we recognize that this is a choice, not an economic necessity, not a technical requirement, but a political choice reflecting specific values and interests, we will continue to repeat the pattern. The Latin American debt crisis began with a decision made in Washington on October 6, 1979. Paul Volcker decided to prioritize American inflation control over global economic stability. He had the power to make that decision unilaterally. Latin America had no say. The crisis ended with decisions made in Washington in 1989. Nicholas Brady decided the time had come for debt relief. He had the power to make that decision. Latin America had no choice but to accept. In between, millions suffered. The question we should ask isn't just what happened. It's who decided, who benefited, and who paid the price. Because in the world of wealth and power, history never ends. It just changes hands. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just rewrite what you thought you knew about power.